We're now ready to begin the last part of the course, very important part of the course, because this is a chance for you to apply what you've learned in the course. And as we debrief the negotiation that you've just concluded, the house on Elm Street, we'll review the concepts covered throughout the course. So before you proceed further, make sure that you have completed the negotiation. I prepped this at the end of Unit 4. As I mentioned then, you should limit your negotiation to 30 minutes. You should pick a negotiation partner, either somebody who you know or somebody else who's taking the course from another part of the world, perhaps. And if you're negotiating with somebody who has not taken the course, please give them a quick review of the kinds of things they should focus on in preparing for negotiation and the tactics that they should use during a negotiation. This will not only help them do better in the negotiation, but it will help you internalize the material. After our debrief, you will have a chance to assess your performance, but please do not complete the assessment until we're finished with the debrief. That way you'll have a basis for the assessment. So, assuming that you have completed the negotiation, again, do not proceed further unless you've completed the negotiation. Otherwise, you'll miss a lot of valuable learning from this session. So let's start with the common information in the negotiation roles. And here again, as mentioned in Unit 4, the common information to both Tracy and Pat is that they are negotiating for the sale of a beautiful old Victorian house on a large lot in a residential neighborhood. The house needs expensive repairs. The seller, who happens to be the uncle of Tracy, and the neighbors have a strong interest in preserving both the house and the neighborhood. The last sale in the neighborhood took place 6 years ago when a similar house was sold for $135,000. That house, however, was well maintained. Since that time, property values have appreciated considerably. And the property has a tax assessment of $140,000, but tax assessments are usually well below market value. So that's the information that both of you had, whether you were in the Tracy role or the Pat role. However, each of you also had some confidential information. So let's review the confidential information. Here is the seller's confidential information, Tracy's information. The seller is elderly and has health problems. The seller needs at least $150,000 so that he can buy a senior apartment. Tracy wants the house but can't afford it. The seller, the uncle, wants to keep possession of the house for 3 months in order to clean out the house. There are no other purchasers, and the seller wants at least a 15% down payment, wants a piece of tile artwork from the kitchen, and a promise not to install plastic siding in the house. The seller feels strongly about preserving the character of the house. Okay, here's the buyer's confidential information. The buyer is an Indian-based company which is building its U.S. headquarters. The buyer will pay up to $250,000 and can pay cash. Pat is representing the buyer as a secret agent. Pat works for a local bank, doesn't make a lot of money, and would love a job offer from this company. So Pat has a lot of incentive to do a good job. The company needs possession in 1 month. If the company is unsuccessful, it will buy another house on Main Street for $265,000. Now note that this is more than what it's willing to pay for the uncle's house, but this house is on Main Street, it's in a better location, and it's also well maintained. The company needs at least 1/3 for a parking lot. So its plans are tear down the house, build a parking lot, and add attractive landscaping. And the company, by the way, is in the business of building senior apartments, but sales are slow right now. Now, after I wrote this negotiation initially and used it a few times in my classes, the World Bank asked for permission to use it in some of their training. And here are the results when the World Bank used this exercise in Vienna. The range of results was a price of a low range of 158,000 to a high range of 220,000. So very significant spread. The median price was 165,000 and the average price was 182,000. So these results from the World Bank generally parallel the results in my negotiation courses when I teach in Ann Arbor or in other parts of the world. Sometimes when I've taught in Italy, a few of the participants in my course come back and they say, well, we were successful. The seller received $140,000 for the house. And I say, well, wait a minute. The seller's role says you have to obtain $150,000. And the participants say, well, yes, we did obtain $150,000. I said, well, but you just told me you got $140,000 for the house. Yes, that's true. Well, I go back and forth, and finally I discovered that the official sales price was $140,000, and the rest was paid under the table. And this is something that's done not only in Italy, it's done around the world, where people try to sell property for close to the tax assessment so that it doesn't increase taxes and figure out other ways to pay the rest. I'm not saying that this is an ethical practice, I'm just saying that it is done around the world. So with that background on the facts, let's now go through the elements that we've talked about in the course and apply them to this negotiation. So element number one is planning your negotiation strategy. And you'll remember we looked at various questions you should ask when planning your negotiation strategy. Very important preliminary question is, should I negotiate at all? And in this case, we have an obvious answer. You don't have a choice because that's part of the exercise. But if you did have a choice, as we discussed earlier, then you'd have to consider your feelings about the negotiation as well as the potential risks and rewards. And we looked at some case examples of how that works. Your next question is a very important one to always ask near the beginning of any preparation for negotiation. Is this a position-based negotiation or an interest-based negotiation? What do you think in this case? In this case, we basically have a buyer who's bringing a large bag of money into the negotiation. The bag of money contains $250,000. And fundamentally, the question is, how much of that money goes to the seller and how much does the buyer get to keep? So we talked about the fundamental differences between the two basic types of negotiation. We have the dividing the pizza negotiation and enlarging the pizza. We looked at all the words associated with them. Buying the pizza is called by academics distributive versus integrative, cooperative versus competitive, win-lose versus win-win, zero-sum, non-zero-sum, adversarial, problem-solving, position-based, interest-based, and claiming value versus creating value. We're not going to go through those again in detail, but the fundamental question here is, when you did your preparation for negotiation, what was your bottom line conclusion? Is this basically a dividing the pizza type negotiation, or where the emphasis is a little more on positional bargaining, or is it building a larger pizza type negotiation where the interests of the parties are more important? If you didn't answer that question during your preparation, please answer it now. Does this basically fall on the left-hand side or the right-hand side. So write down your answer, and we'll return to this later in our debrief of this negotiation. But also remember that even where it appears to be a position-based negotiation, you should always search for underlying interests in an attempt to build a larger pie. Where it's true positional negotiation, you're probably not going to spend as much time searching for interest because it might be futile. But at least try to find those interests. And also remember that even with an interest-based negotiation, after you build the larger pie, you're still going to return to positional bargaining. Okay, next question. Are you trying to resolve a dispute with this negotiation or make a deal? We distinguish the two by looking at the Janus-like quality of negotiations. Dispute resolution type negotiations tend to be more position-based, deal-making more interest-based, and there are other differences as well. We don't have to worry about that too much here because clearly this is a deal-making negotiation. They're not trying to resolve a dispute. So that covers several key questions that you should ask in preparing for a negotiation, and in the next segment we'll look at the remaining questions. We're now ready to look at the next element in planning your negotiation strategy, which relates to how you should analyze a negotiation. This lies at the heart of any negotiation, this negotiation or any other deal-making or dispute resolution negotiation. So let's start with just a reminder of what the confidential interests of the parties are. Here are the seller's confidential information, and here are the elements of the buyer's confidential information that we reviewed earlier. So let's start with the analysis from the seller's side. Now, if you're the seller, if you're Tracy, preparing for this negotiation, the very first question you always ask and always focus on is, what is my BATNA? Because BATNA is what gives you leverage. BATNA is what gives you power. So in preparing for this negotiation, you should have asked that as your initial question. And how did you answer that question? If you're the seller, if you're Tracy, what is your best alternative to a negotiated agreement? Think about that for a second. You might want to press pause, write down your answer. Again, that's the most important question. And then you would add the other elements of an analysis as we discussed. What's your reservation price? Looking at these facts, what is your reservation price? And then what is your most likely price and what's your stretch goal? Most likely isn't quite as obvious from these facts, although you could construct a most likely based on sales price of the other house, based on tax assessment. And stretch goal is even more fuzzier. Remember, you want a stretch goal that is large, but not so large that you lose credibility. So you might want to try to draw out this analysis showing your BATNA, reservation price, most likely, and stretch goal. And this is what it would look like. Your reservation price is $150. I picked a random most likely of $160 and a stretch goal of $190. Your BATNA here is that the uncle, the elderly uncle who has health problems, would be stuck in a house, an old house that needs maintenance. And that's your BATNA because you have no other buyers. So if this deal does not go through, then your BATNA is a bad one. That's why if you are Tracy, and if you can even get $150,000, you can grab it because that enables you to put the uncle in a senior apartment. So that's the analysis from the seller's side. Now, what about the analysis from the buyer's side? Again, look at these facts, and if you're the buyer, what is your BATNA? What is your reservation price, your most likely, and your stretch goal? And here you can see your reservation price is $250,000. You're willing to pay up to that amount to buy the property. Your BATNA is buying another house on Main Street, a well-maintained house in a better location for $265,000. And then you would have to come up with some figures representing your most likely and your stretch goal. And so as the buyer, this is a depiction of your analysis. And then the final question, very important question, what is the ZOPA? What is the zone of potential agreement? Looking at these two analyses, what's your conclusion? The deal can take place between what price and what price. And remember from our earlier discussion, it can take place between the reservation price of the seller, that's the lowest amount the seller will take, and the reservation price of the buyer, which is the highest price that the buyer is willing to pay. And so this would be the zone of potential agreement. We have an especially large zone of potential agreement here. The two parties should be able to reach an agreement, at least on price, because of this large ZOPA. Okay, next question in your preparation for a negotiation is this a cross-cultural negotiation? I don't know the answer to that because it depends who you selected as your negotiation counterpart. If you selected somebody from another part of the world, then this becomes a relevant question. And as we discussed earlier, you'll want to use the assessment that we talked about. And what you want to do is to complete the assessment yourself and then try to predict where the other side falls on each of these 10 dimensions, and then do a gap analysis. Look at where there's a gap between your style and the other side's style, and be prepared to address that gap during your negotiations. Next question, how should I handle ethical issues? Now think about this one for a second. If you were Tracy, were there any ethical issues that concerned you from your side? And same question for Pat. Any ethical issues in this negotiation that concerned you? Well, here are a couple of examples. Tracy, you think that the basement in the house might have a leak. Would you tell the buyer about this potential problem? Also, you've heard rumors that a fast food restaurant or a convenience store might move in next door to the house. You think the buyer is buying the house for his family, and the value of the property might be reduced if it's next to a fast food restaurant. Do you tell the buyer about these rumors? From the buyer's perspective, there's a big ethical question, and that is, you are acting as a secret agent. Tracy has no idea that you're representing a large company. You want to keep that secret so that you can increase the price of the property. How do you feel about that? Would you disclose that to the seller? What standards would you use in making that decision? Well, we talked about the standards earlier in the course, and we said there are two categories of standards. One category is the list of law-based standards, and we looked at 3 of these. One is fraud. Did either side commit fraud by failing to disclose the information? Well, when you look at the definition of fraud, it is a false representation. And neither side made a false representation. In other words, Tracy didn't say to Pat, well, there are no problems with the basement. That might be considered fraud. And Pat didn't say to Tracy, by the way, I don't represent a company, I don't represent a principal in these negotiations. I'm not a secret agent. That would be fraud. That would be a false representation. So that didn't appear here However, this would be the result in the United States, not necessarily true around the world. In some countries, there might be a duty to disclose, let's say, a leaky basement. And even in the United States, there often are specific statutes that require disclosure in a real estate contract when you know that there's a problem. But under the general definition of fraud here, no fraud. There is no fiduciary duty. Pat and Tracy are dealing at arm's length. There's no special relationship between the seller and buyer that would create this high duty of trust and loyalty. And also no evidence of unconscionability. Remember, unconscionability arises when there's an absence of choice. One party is a lot more powerful than the other. That's absent here. And no evidence that the contract or the agreement that they might reach contains unreasonable terms. So probably when you look at the legal standards, there are no problems, but you still have to decide beyond the law whether you're going to make disclosure to the other side. And here's where the general ethical standards come into play. As I recommended earlier in the course, you might want to select one or more of these standards to use in guiding you through your future negotiations. And it's probably better to select the standards now rather than waiting until you're in the middle of a negotiation when it becomes tougher to select an independent, objective standard. Okay, so next question, and the last question that relates to preparing for a negotiation. Should I use an agent to negotiate for me? Well, this question has already been answered. We know that the uncle is negotiating through Agent Tracy, and the company is negotiating through Agent Pat. And we also know that in this case, Pat is a secret agent, and the company wants to work through a secret agent because if the other side, if Tracy knows that the agent is representing a large multinational company, then the price of the real estate is going to skyrocket. So there are business considerations for using a secret agent. There's one key issue that arises in any contract involving agents. And as we discussed earlier, this is the way business is conducted, through agents. So let me ask that question. If you are, this goes back to one of our earlier slides, if you are Pat here, representing the company, what's the very first question you ask in any negotiation before you go further? The very first question. This is a review question. And did you do this during your negotiation? The answer, as you may recall, is, does the other side have authority? Now, if you look closely at Tracy's role, the answer to that question is probably no. Tracy probably has authority to discuss the purchase with Pat, but not to actually sign a contract. And so because of that lack of authority, then you technically do not have a contract. If you're unhappy with the results from your negotiation, you can continue negotiation for as long as you'd like, because legally you would not have a deal given the lack of authority. So that concludes our look at the issues relating to preparing and planning your negotiation strategy in this particular case. Let's now move on to the tactics that you can use during the face-to-face negotiations. In this segment, we're going to focus on the key tactics that you can use for success. And earlier in the course, we talked about 3 key tactics. Number 1, getting to know the other side. Second, understanding your power. And finally, using psychological tools and avoiding psychological traps. Getting to know the other side is something that is very useful in any negotiation. In this particular negotiation, you may have picked a friend as a counterpart for the negotiation, in which case you could probably skip this step since you already know that person. But if you picked somebody who you didn't know before, then it always makes sense in any negotiation, dispute resolution or deal making, to spend some time getting to know the other side before you start talking about the actual details of the negotiation. As we discussed earlier, this is more difficult in some cultures than in others, but it's a very worthwhile exercise. Okay, second piece of this is understanding your power. And as we discussed in the course, there are a couple of elements of power. One element is the ability to ask questions and to listen carefully to the answers. And so in this case, in this negotiation, did you ask questions? And did you listen carefully and gather information? Because in a general sense, information is what gives you power in a negotiation. It's not talking, it's not trying to persuade the other side, it's listening carefully and gathering that information. For example, if you were Pat in this case, did you ask Tracy about the uncle? What's the name of your uncle? How old is your uncle? How long has your uncle been in the house? Why is the uncle selling? If you ask this type of question, then you can quickly put together a picture showing old person, bad health, rundown house, needs to sell. And that's going to be very useful information in your negotiation, especially when you move to the next aspect of power, and perhaps the most important aspect, and that's your BATNA strategy. Because the piece of information that specifically gives you power relates to BATNA. And so in this case, first of all, were you able to find out what their BATNA was and how powerful they are? And then second, once you find their BATNA, were you able to weaken their power? So, for example, let's say you're Tracy in this negotiation, and you learn that there's a company involved, and that if the company doesn't buy your property, they're going to buy another piece of property on Main Street for $265,000. Now, think of how you can play with that information to weaken their power. If you're Tracy, you're going to say to Pat, now, let me see if I have this straight. You're a large multinational company. You're coming into our little community. And the very first thing you do to build your corporate headquarters is buy a beautiful, well-maintained house on Main Street in a residential area. And you're going to flatten that house and cover the lot with asphalt and turn it into a parking lot. Can you imagine how outraged the people in this community are going to be? There are going to be protests. You're going to lose any goodwill right off the bat. It's going to destroy your business opportunities. That's how you play with their sense of their BATNA. That's how you play with their power, how you weaken their power. And then the final piece of BATNA strategy is improving your own power. So in this case, as we discussed earlier, the seller, the uncle, really has an awful BATNA. We have an elderly man, bad health, rundown house, no other buyers. So what you should do to improve your BATNA is obviously find other buyers. So number one, if I were the uncle or if I were Tracy, I'd start by touching up the house. I'd buy some cans of paint and paint the house, do it myself if I had to try to make the house look better. Number two, I would actively search for other buyers. It sounds like the owner, the seller, has been very relaxed about finding other buyers. So I would start by putting an ad in the paper or elsewhere saying the home is for sale by owner, or taking it a step further, obviously, hiring a broker who could generate interest in the house and bring in other buyers, which then improves my power and strengthens my BATNA. So that's your power strategy. That's specifically your BATNA strategy in this negotiation. The final element that relates to your actual negotiation deals with the psychological tools that you can use and the traps that you want to avoid. And during the course, we talked about 9 of these tools and traps. The first one, mythical fixed pie assumption, was the assumption that our interests conflict with the interests of the other side. This is perhaps the most important element that relates to the house on Elm Street, and I'm going to save it until the end. So let's go through some of the other ones. First, anchoring. As we defined it earlier, we tend to anchor on an initial value when trying to evaluate an item that has an uncertain value. So question here, the big question with anchoring is who should throw out the first price? And how did you deal with that question here? During your negotiation, think back, did you throw out the first price or did the other side throw out the first price? Think of the advice we talked about when talking about anchoring. The fundamental conclusion was, when you're dealing with an item that has an uncertain value, let the other side throw out the first price, because that's a way for you to gather information about that value. Whereas if you're fairly confident of the value, then you throw out the first price and try to anchor them to your price. So what's our situation here? Certain value, uncertain value. In my opinion, this is a case involving property with a very uncertain value, because I gave you very few facts about the value of the house. You know what the tax assessment is. You know the value of a house that was sold 6 years ago. But apart from that, very uncertain value. So if I were the negotiator here, I would try to get the other side to throw out the first price. And I noticed over the years that the people in this negotiation who do throw out the first price often get destroyed. So you'll have a situation where, for example, the buyer will walk into the negotiation thinking, well, I'm probably going to have to pay around $200,000 for this house. And then the seller throws out the first price, which might be, let's say, $170,000. And right away, the buyer is $30,000 ahead of what they thought the price would be. And immediately, the great negotiators immediately recalibrate, and they act very sad. They act very upset by that price of $170 and try to negotiate it down further. The negotiators who aren't as good might accept that offer of $170 right away. Now, if you're the seller here and you throw out the first price of $170 and the other side accepts immediately, are you happy about that? Probably most of us would be very upset with that, because we suddenly realize, hey, we picked a price that was much too low. They accepted it too quickly. I should have selected another price. So if you ever want to make somebody upset in a negotiation, accept their offer immediately. Even when they're making a great offer, you'll make them feel better if it's a bit of a struggle and if you negotiate over what they're offering. So those are the considerations regarding anchoring and first price. Overconfidence is not a huge issue in this case, but let me give you an illustration of how it might come into play. If I had asked you, let's say you're Tracy here, the seller. If I had asked you to estimate the ZOPA, the zone of potential agreement, before you started the negotiation, what would your range be in estimating that ZOPA? My guess is that very few of you would have selected a range as large as 150 to 250,000. Most people would select a much narrower range, which illustrates overconfidence. But if you were able to overcome overconfidence and select a larger ZOPA, then it expands your thinking about the case. If you realized, for instance, that the buyer would be willing to pay as much as $250,000, then you begin to think, well, what's behind this buyer? What is the buyer interested in? And then all of a sudden you start to look at the facts a little bit differently. You realize, well, wait a minute, no sales in this neighborhood for 6 years. And now all of a sudden, house behind me has just sold. Somebody is negotiating to buy the house next to that. And now somebody is negotiating to buy my property. Looks like these aren't individuals. Looks like it's a company trying to assemble land. And then, of course, you ratchet up your price. So overconfidence can have an impact on the success of a negotiation. Framing. Another issue that looks like it's not directly related to this negotiation. It's hard to imagine how you could frame choices that might affect decisions. We'll turn to the remaining psychological tools and traps in our next segment. Let's take a look at some other psychological tools and traps that might arise in a negotiation like the house on Elm Street. First, the principle of availability, which means that we make decisions on the basis of information that is easy to retrieve. It's hard to determine from these facts where availability might apply, but just for example, when Tracy and Pat are thinking about the values of the house, I think it's easy for them to rely on some information that's very easy to retrieve, such as the tax assessment on the house and the value of the most recent sale in the neighborhood. And by doing that, perhaps they overlook some other information, such as the appreciation in real estate values. The facts state in both roles that there has been substantial appreciation in real estate over the past few years. So whether this is availability or anchoring, there are other explanations, but I imagine there's a tendency for you and I to rely on the numbers that are easily available, the tax assessment and the prior sales price. Escalation is another psychological tool or trap. And our basic takeaway from our discussion from escalation was that as negotiators, we should try to look at negotiations from the perspective of the other side. This is what separates good negotiators from great negotiators. And so, for example, if you are Pat, try to look at the real estate sale from the perspective of the uncle. If you have asked the right questions earlier, you know that the uncle is old, in poor health. You know that the house has not been well maintained. And so looking at it from his perspective, you realize that probably he wants a sale as soon as possible. Another principle is reciprocation, or also known as reciprocity, which means that if you give something to the other side, they feel a need to repay you. Now, reciprocity in a negotiation like this often arises when there are multiple issues, and some of these issues mean more to one side than to the other, which gives you a chance to give something to the other side and perhaps get something in return. So, for example, in this negotiation, the uncle wants a piece of tile from the kitchen. Unknown to the uncle, giving the tile means nothing to Pat because the house is going to be knocked down in any event. As far as Pat is concerned, the uncle can have the entire kitchen if he wants to. But of course, Pat is not going to mention that. And so what Pat could do is to mull over the request, make it sound as though it's a difficult request, and then maybe offer the uncle not only the tile, but something else from the kitchen. Maybe there are other tiles in the kitchen. And so Pat could say to the uncle, look, it appears that this tile means a lot to you. What if I gave you the whole set of tiles? So Pat would be giving something to the uncle, and then the uncle, with given human nature, might feel the need to reciprocate, to give something back to Pat. So when it comes time to negotiate something that's important to Pat, such as the date of transfer of possession, the uncle might be more willing to budge. So that's how reciprocity plays out in a multiple issue negotiation like this. We have the contrast principle, where items look quite different when presented in sequence, and that principle probably is not relevant in this particular negotiation. The final psychological tool or trap is the big picture perspective, which is basically saying don't get lost in the details. This is another very important perspective, and I want to save that along with the fixed pi assumption for our concluding look at this negotiation. So I'm going to put that on the shelf for a few minutes. So those are the 9 psychological tools and traps and how they apply to this negotiation. We're now ready to take a look at the 3rd and 4th stages in the negotiation process and how they apply to the house on Elm Street. The 3rd piece is closing the deal and creating a contract, and then finally there's the performance aspect. When we looked at contract creation, we mentioned that there are 4 key issues that you should stuff into your pocket for future negotiations. These are the key elements involved in contract creation. So let's go through these elements quickly and look at how they apply to the house on Elm Street. First of all, is there an agreement? Well, I'm assuming that if you and the other side did reach an agreement, if you were successful in your negotiation, there was an offer and an acceptance and an agreement. Was there consideration? That's a pretty easy one in this case. One side, the uncle, is transferring property, is giving up something. The other side, the company, is making payment, giving up something, and therefore consideration is present. Is the agreement legal? Well, of course, yeah, transfer of a house is legal, no problem there. Must the deal be in writing? Now, here's a stumbling block that my guess is many of you encountered. When we looked at writing, we said that either the agreement is in writing or it isn't. And if it is in writing, then there are a cluster of issues relating to a technicality called the parole evidence rule, which basically means that what you put in your final written agreement governs over any agreements you made before or at the same time as that written agreement. The issue in this case is the risk that you did not put your agreement in writing. When we talked about the writing requirements, we mentioned that generally oral contracts are enforceable, even contracts for millions of dollars. However, there are certain exceptions, there are certain rules in every country around the world that says that certain contracts must be in writing. And the example I used was the real estate contract. And so the question here is, when you negotiated your deal, did you put the agreement in writing and did you sign the agreement? As we discussed, this doesn't have to be on parchment, it doesn't have to be on fancy paper, it doesn't have to say contract at the top, it could be jotted out on a napkin. Any writing qualifies as long as it contains the right contents, the subject matter, etc., and is signed. And so if you did that, then you have a deal If you did not do that, then you can continue negotiating. You don't yet have a deal. Just to conclude that, as a reminder of what we talked about, we talked about whether writing is required, and here the answer to that question is yes. And then second, we said as a practical approach, you should always put your contracts in writing because the human memory is often weak, and because then if you put your agreements in writing, you don't have to worry about the subtleties of the law deciding whether it's a contract that has to be in writing or not, because you have met that requirement. So in addition to the writing requirement, there's the question of performance of the contract. And we mentioned that if there is performance, there's no problem. If there isn't performance, then hopefully you have established a dispute resolution process so that you don't have to go to court, sit around in court for years, spend a lot of money. And we specifically discussed ADR, alternative dispute resolution. So in addition to putting your contract in writing, an additional question is, did you include in the writing an ADR contract clause? This is not required, but many people, especially in business, value highly ADR clauses because it does avoid litigation. And so we talked about the different types of ADR clauses. There's the possibility of mediation alone. There's a possibility of arbitration alone. Or you can link mediation and arbitration with an escalation clause that provides that you start with mediation, and then if mediation fails, you can move on to arbitration, and you can add an additional link. You can provide that you start with a negotiation unassisted by a third party. Then if that fails, you bring in a third party mediator, and if that fails, you bring in a third party arbitrator. So that concludes our look at how you develop the contract. The especially important issue here, did you put your contract in writing? And the performance question, have you included a dispute resolution clause? We're now ready to move on to our last part of the debrief, where we will ask whether the mythical fixed pi assumption might change the results that you reached in your negotiation. As we finish our debrief of the House on Elm Street, let's return to the two psychological tools and traps we put on the shelf during our earlier discussion. The first is the mythical fixed pi assumption, the assumption that our interests conflict with the interests of the other side. And the second is the big picture perspective. Don't get lost in the details. And let's look at how these two in combination might change the results in your negotiation. Remember that we started with this bag of money that the buyer brings into the negotiation, $250,000. And one of the fundamental questions in the negotiation is how much of that money goes to the seller and how much does the buyer get to keep? And so with that perspective in mind, I asked you earlier, is this a dividing the pizza type negotiation or an enlarging the pizza negotiation? And of course, we've gone through these various words that are used to describe each type of negotiation. And I think the basic conclusion earlier was this is a dividing the pizza type negotiation. This is a distributive negotiation, competitive, win-lose, zero-sum, adversarial, position-based, and a negotiation where you want to claim as much value as possible. So with positional negotiation, you still, as we pointed out earlier, want to try to find underlying interests and to build a larger pie. And we combine that with the mythical fixed pi assumption, which is when we identify those interests, can we also identify interests where the seller's interests do not conflict with the buyer's interest? This creates especially a chance to build a larger pie. So another way to view this is we started with that bag of money containing $250,000, and let's assume that the result of the negotiation was a common result is that the seller sells the property for $170,000, which means that the buyer, the buying company, gets to keep $80,000. And the question is, can we build a larger pie? Can we, in effect, build a larger bag of money so that the seller walks away with $200,000 rather than $170,000, and the buyer gets to keep $200,000 instead of $80,000? In other words, how can the two parties take $400,000 worth of value out of a bag of money that initially contained only $250,000? To answer that question, we have to do an interests analysis. Try to find the interests of of each side. So let's go back to our interests slide. We went through earlier these various interests of the two parties. So for example, when the uncle's position is, I need $150,000, the why question would lead to a search for the reason why the uncle needs the $150,000, and that is he needs it for a senior apartment. That's the interest that underlies the position. So as you look at these interests that you would develop with an interest analysis, then the question is, do you see any interests that are not in conflict? So, obviously the seller wants as much money as possible. The buyer wants to keep as much money as possible. That looks like a conflict. The seller wants to keep possession for 3 months. The company needs possession in 1 month. That's a conflict, etc. So where are the interests in conflict and where are they not in conflict? Can you identify especially an interest on each side that is not in conflict, that represents the key to developing a larger pie? Think about that for a second. Press pause if you want to. Okay, let's go back to the interests slide one more time. And what we see here in red is that a key underlying interest of the uncle, and that's the reason why he's selling his house, is he needs a senior apartment. He can no longer maintain this big old Victorian house. And the company has this business interest. This is why the company is doing business in the United States. The company builds senior apartments, and sales are slow. The buyer's role mentions that the company has a very large inventory of empty apartments. So when you think about that, think about how you can connect the dots to create a larger pie. There are a number of possibilities. Let me explain one possibility. So we start with the initial contract. The seller is selling the house to the company for $170,000. But what would happen if, instead of paying the seller $170,000, the company gave the seller, the uncle, one of its senior apartments, one of its many empty senior apartments? They're on the market for $200,000. So the uncle, instead of ending up with $170,000, ends up with a $200,000 senior apartment. Furthermore, according to the buyer's role, it only cost the company $150,000 to build the apartments, so you could say that the company has saved the difference between the $200,000 and the $150,000 that it cost to build. That reduces the buyer's cost to $150,000. And then remember, the company does not need the entire lot. They just need the back third of the lot. So what the company could then do is to transfer the house and the front 2/3 of the lot to Tracy, the relative of the uncle who really wanted the house but couldn't afford it. The company could sell it to Tracy for, let's say, $100,000. The company could finance the purchase. The buyer's role states that they've arranged financing with the bank. And so this reduces the company's cost by another $100,000, which brings their net cost down to $50,000, and which means that they get to keep $200,000 from that bag of money, in effect. So you look at this solution and look at the interests that it satisfies. The seller's interests are met, plus the seller has made another $30,000 by getting the $200,000 condo instead of the $170,000 in cash. Tracy's interests are met. Tracy got the house he or she wanted. The company's interests are met. They got the land they need for a parking lot. They have achieved additional shareholder value by keeping $200,000 out of that bag of money, and they've maintained their community reputation. They're not tearing down one of these beautiful old homes in a residential neighborhood. And Pat, hopefully, will get the job with the company. So what this takes, and what it takes in many negotiations, is the ability to not get lost in the details, but to step back and look at the big picture. Not get lost in the details, well, how much will the company pay for the house? What's the purchase price? But step back and ask, looking at it big picture, what kind of business is the company in? And how might their interests match the interests of the uncle? Find situations where the interests aren't in conflict. I hope that you had a chance to look at the basketball video that I assigned earlier. As you noted from that video, when you count the number of passes made by the players wearing white shirts, you get so lost in the details that you miss the large gorilla who walks out to the center of the video and pounds its chest before walking off. It's easy to miss even a large gorilla when you focus too much on the details. So bottom line, this is the way in which you can start with a bag of money containing $250,000 that is split 170 versus 80 and build a larger pie so that each side benefits by walking away with $200,000. So this negotiation has given us a chance to look at the big picture of the course, to bring all of the elements together. We've just gone through the 4-stage negotiation process as it applies to this negotiation. Now, the important final step for you is to finish the end game by doing an evaluation. And so you should do a self-assessment. What did you do well? How can you improve in future negotiations? And then, very important, give assessments to each other. Be very candid and honest. What did the other side do well? How can they improve? Because this course provides virtually the only opportunity to get that type of candid feedback. And as you do your self-assessment and as you assess the other side, remember this list of assessment questions that we reviewed before. So that pretty much wraps up our course. We've covered a lot of material in a short amount of time. And I want to thank you. I want to thank those of you from the United States and those of you from around the world for participating in this course. And I'd like to leave you with a blessing. In my courses at Michigan, I do a cross-cultural negotiation that involves a negotiation between a financial services company and a Native American tribe. And this particular Native American tribe has a blessing that I'd like to share with you, which is, may you walk in beauty. And by that they mean, may you achieve balance and harmony in life. And I hope that by taking this course that you have had a chance to consider some strategies and some skills that might enable you to achieve balance in both your business life and your personal life. Good luck.